Harlan Covey had spent 31 years learning that the quietest men in a room are usually the ones holding the most weight. He had learned this from his father, who built furniture by hand in a garage in Shreveport and never once raised his voice at a customer, not even when they tried to pay him less than what was agreed. Harlan had carried that lesson into every contract he signed, every handshake he offered, every year of a marriage that had slowly, deliberately turned against him without ever announcing itself. He was 44 years old on the night his wife told him she was done with him, not in anger. That was the part that stayed with him longest afterward, not the words, but the temperature of them. Simone Covey delivered the end of their marriage the way a hotel concierge delivers a bill. Politely, efficiently, with the slight impatience of someone who has other things to attend to. She was standing in the kitchen of their Buckhead home in Charlotte, wearing the cream linen blazer she kept for important meetings, when she said it. Harlan had just come in from a site walk at the distribution center project on the south side. His boots were still on. He had a pen tucked behind his ear and a rolled-up set of drawings under his arm, and he was thinking about whether the structural steel delivery had been logged correctly, when Simone set down her coffee cup and looked at him with the particular steadiness of someone who has rehearsed. "I want you to move out by Friday," she said. "My attorney will be in touch next week." He stood there. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside. "You want to tell me why?" he said. His voice came out even. He was grateful for that. Simone tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she thought a question was beneath the conversation. "I think you know why," she said. "I've grown into something larger than this. Larger than us." She gestured, not at anything specific, just at the space between them, as if the distance was self-explanatory. "My father's estate cleared probate this week. I have resources now. I have options, and I think it's time I used them." Harlan said nothing for a moment. He looked at the woman he had been married to for 11 years. He thought, with the quiet precision of a man who has been paying close attention, about the documents he had spent the last 14 months preparing, about the calls he had made, about the meetings that had taken place in a law office in uptown Charlotte that Simone had never been told about, because Reginald Morrow had specifically asked him not to. "Simone," he said. "Friday, Harlan." She picked up her coffee and left the room. He stood in the kitchen alone. He took the pen from behind his ear, set it on the counter. Outside, the evening light was doing the thing it did in early September in the Carolinas, going golden and heavy, making everything look more settled than it was. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text to a number he had saved under the initials CB. "She's made her move. Prepare the filing." The reply came in 40 seconds. "Already done. See you Thursday." Harlan picked up his pen. He went to the dining room table and unrolled his drawings and got back to work. Because that was the kind of man he was. He finished what he started. He always had. If you have ever been the person in a relationship who loved quietly, who showed up without announcing it, who built and gave and protected while the other person planned their exit, stay with me. Because this story is going to matter to you. 11 years earlier, Harlan Covey had been a project manager for a mid-sized commercial construction firm in Charlotte, recently relocated from Baton Rouge. Still learning the geography of a new city and the rhythm of a life that had not yet become anything in particular. He was 33, owned a practical sedan and a rented 2-bedroom apartment with a view of a parking structure, and was, by most measures, unremarkable. He did not mind this. He was building. Building was a process that required patience and resisted ornamentation. He met Simone Morrow at a fundraiser for a children's literacy nonprofit. She was 29. Beautiful in a composed, deliberate way, the kind of beauty that comes from knowing exactly how a room works and where to stand in it. Her father, Reginald Morrow, was one of Charlotte's most respected commercial real estate developers, a man who had started with a single property in the Belmont neighborhood and expanded over 40 years into a portfolio worth considerably more than anyone outside his family fully understood. Simone and Harlan were introduced by a mutual acquaintance. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing consequential and then exchanged numbers. Harlan called 3 days later, which was 2 days later than she expected. She thought about that. She liked it. They married 2 years after that, at the Morrows estate in Dilworth, on a June afternoon that the photographer described as the best light she'd worked with all year. For a while, it was good. Harlan learned Reginald's business from the inside out, the way he learned everything, methodically and without ego. He was useful, visibly and without performance. When Reginald's senior project manager left suddenly to start his own firm and took 3 junior staff with him, it was Harlan who stepped in, reorganized the remaining team, and delivered 2 stalled developments on schedule, at a modest personal cost in sleep and weekends he never once mentioned. Reginald noticed. He was the kind of man who noticed everything and said very little about what he saw. Simone, in those early years, still looked at Harlan with something genuine, something close to admiration. She liked that he was steady. She liked that he did not need to fill every room with himself. She liked these things right up until the point she began to mistake them for limitations. The change was not sudden. It was the kind of change that happens in small adjustments, the way a building settles. 1 year Simone stopped coming to the job sites. Another year she stopped asking about the projects. She developed a new circle of friends, people with old money and newer ambitions, and she began to describe Harlan in those circles, not unkindly but with a certain careful diminishment, as dependable. The way someone might describe a piece of furniture. She began spending time with a man named Preston Vale. Harlan became aware of this, the way he became aware of most things, through careful attention to patterns rather than any single event. Preston was an investment consultant 40 years old, with a practiced charm and the particular confidence of a man who had never faced a consequence he could not negotiate around. He drove a car that cost what some people made in a year and wore clothes that announced their own expense without apologizing for it. Harlan watched. He said nothing. He did not say nothing because he had no words. He said nothing because he was waiting to understand what he was actually looking at before he responded to it. What clarified everything was a Tuesday afternoon in February, 11 months before Simone asked him to leave. Harlan had come home early from a site. The water main on the South Side project had ruptured and the crew had been sent home. He pulled into the driveway at 2 p.m., walked through the back entrance, and heard Simone's voice from the upstairs office, low and deliberate, the tone she used when she was being careful. He did not stand outside the door. He went to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat at the table. He heard enough. She was talking about the estate, about what would happen when her father passed, about timing, about an account in a bank she had set up in her own name, separate, unconnected to any joint filing. The other voice was Preston's. He was asking specific questions about probate timelines. Harlan drank his coffee. When Simone came downstairs and found him there, she startled. He looked at her steadily. "Water main broke," he said. "Came home early." Nothing in his face gave anything away. That evening, he called Cassandra Blythe. Cassandra Blythe ran a forensic accounting and estate litigation practice out of a small, excellent office in Midtown Charlotte. She was 52 years old, the kind of attorney who dressed like a librarian and operated like a surgeon. She had worked with Harlan twice before, both times in complicated construction contract disputes, and had won both. He trusted her the way he trusted structural engineers, not based on credentials alone, but on demonstrated precision under pressure. He told her everything. She listened without interrupting. She made notes on a yellow legal pad, the kind with the thin red margin line that lawyers of a certain generation still preferred. When he finished, she looked at him over the top of her reading glasses and said, "What does your father-in-law know?" "I don't know yet," Harlan said. "Find out," she said. "Soon." He did not have to wait long. Reginald Morrow called him the following week. He asked Harlan to come by the house in Dilworth alone on a Saturday morning. He said it the way men of his generation say things that matter, plainly, without explanation. Harlan was there at 9. Reginald was 71 years old and had known since the previous spring that the cancer in his pancreas was not going to be negotiated with. He had accepted this with the same measured stillness with which he had accepted every hard thing in a life that had not been without them. He was sitting in the sunroom when Harlan arrived, with a cup of coffee and a file folder on the table in front of him. The room faced the garden. Everything outside was bare and gray in the February light, which Harlan later thought was appropriate. Reginald did not make small talk. He said, "Sit down, son. I need you to listen very carefully, and I need you to not interrupt until I am finished." Harlan sat. He listened. Reginald had spent 8 months working with his personal attorney, a man named Archie Folsom, who had represented the Morrow family for nearly 30 years, restructuring his entire estate. Every property, every account, every operational holding of Morrow Development, totaling somewhere in the vicinity of $38 million, had been placed inside a private irrevocable trust. The trust was structured with a corresponding debt obligation built into its architecture, equal to the total asset value, $38 million, documented, filed, and notarized. The sole creditor on that debt, the only individual on earth with the legal authority to call it in, was Harlan Covey. Harlan sat very still. "She is my daughter," Reginald said. "I love her in the way that a father loves a child who has disappointed him thoroughly and still completely. But I have been watching her for 2 years now, and I know what she is planning, and I know who she is planning it with, and I will not allow what I built to be taken apart for someone else's comfort." He paused. "You saved this company once. 3 years ago, when the Belmont project nearly went under and every senior manager was ready to walk. You did not walk. You stayed up 4 nights in a row, renegotiated with the bank, personally guaranteed 2 vendor contracts, and delivered the project. You did not tell me until afterward. That is who you are." Harlan said nothing. "I am asking you to do one more thing for me," Reginald said. "Wait. Let her make the choice I believe she is going to make, and when she does, step in. Not for revenge. I want to be very clear on that, for preservation." He slid the file folder across the table. "Everything is documented. Cassandra Blythe is a good attorney. I have spoken with Archie. They are expecting your call." Harlan opened the folder. He read the first 2 pages without speaking. Then he closed it and looked at the old man. "Yes, sir," he said. "I understand." Reginald looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Slowly, the way people nod when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and have finally been able to set part of it down. "Take care of what we built," he said. Reginald Morrow passed away 4 months later, on a warm Thursday in June, at the hospital in Dilworth with his wife Loretta at his bedside. The service was attended by nearly 400 people. The mayor's office sent a representative. Former business partners, who had not been in the same room in 20 years, came down from Virginia and up from Georgia to sit in the wooden pews of the church, where Reginald had been a deacon for 3 decades. Simone stood at the front in a black dress and received condolences with the practiced composure of someone who is already thinking about what comes next. Harlan stood beside her and said the right things to the right people and shook the right hands. He drove them home afterward. He made dinner. He sat with Loretta for an hour while Simone took calls from a financial advisor whose number had not appeared in her phone history before her father's diagnosis. That night, after the house was quiet, he called Cassandra. "It starts," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been ready for 3 weeks." The following 14 months were the most precise of Harlan Covey's professional life. Everything he had ever learned about managing complexity, about maintaining composure under sustained pressure, about the difference between reacting and planning, was applied in those months to a single long game. He and Cassandra worked in careful, documented sequence. A full forensic audit of Morrow Development's operating accounts going back 24 months, legal transfers of lien positions on 4 properties, the methodical positioning of the trust's debt authority in preparation for activation, every step filed correctly, every document notarized and cross-referenced. Meanwhile, at home, Harlan cooked dinner on Sundays. He attended Loretta's doctor appointments when Simone was unavailable, which was often. He drove his 7-year-old Silverado truck to work every morning and did not comment on the credit card statements that began to reflect charges for things that did not belong in the joint accounts. Hotel rooms in cities where no business of theirs was located, dinner charges at restaurants that seated to a piece of jewelry he had not given her. He noticed everything. He documented what mattered. He said nothing, not because he lacked the words, but because patience, applied correctly, is its own kind of leverage. His mother, Dorothea, who lived in a careful little house in Huntersville and called on Sunday evenings with the regularity of a tide, picked up what was happening without needing to be told. She asked him once, in October, whether he was sleeping. "Enough," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "You know what your grandfather used to say." "Still water," Harlan said. "Still water runs deep," she said. "And it gets where it's going." She paused. "Come by for dinner this week. I made the brisket." He came by on Wednesday. They sat at the same table where he had done homework as a child. She did not ask further questions. She passed him the brisket, and they talked about the weather and the neighborhood. And when he left, she held his face in her hands for a moment, the way she had when he was small, and said nothing, because she understood that some forms of love communicate better through touch than words. 6 weeks before Harlan received Simone's notice to vacate, she threw a party. She called it a celebration of new beginnings. She booked the private event room at the Ivy's Hotel in Uptown Charlotte. 200 invitations printed on heavy stock in a pale gold script. The guest list covered everyone who mattered in her world. The Dilworth old money families, the South Park professional network, her father's former business associates, the church community that had known the Morrow name for 40 years. She spent nearly $14,000 on the event and put the entirety of it on the Morrow Development corporate card, which she had been treating as a personal expense account for the better part of a year. Preston Vale arrived with her, no longer positioned as a business associate, no longer a secret. He stood at the entrance to that gold-lit room in a charcoal suit and shook hands with people who had known Reginald Morrow all their lives and smiled with the ease of a man who has decided he has already won. Simone sent Harlan a message through her assistant the morning of the event. It said, "Mrs. Covey requests your presence this evening. The final separation agreement will be available for signature at 8 p.m., not at a law office, in a hotel event room, in front of the people who had been her father's community for decades. She wanted witnesses. She wanted Charlotte to see it." When her assistant confirmed he would attend, Simone said to the room, "Good, let him show up." Harlan spent that morning at his mother's house in Huntersville. Dorothea made biscuits the proper way, with the buttermilk she kept specifically for this purpose on the second shelf of the refrigerator. They sat at the kitchen table, and the morning light came through the east window and made everything look unhurried and manageable. His mother did not ask how he was feeling. She poured coffee and said, after a while, "You sure about tonight?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. She looked at him the long way, the look that takes decades to develop. "Your father would have liked how you handled this," she said finally. Harlan was quiet. "I think Mr. Morrow would have too," he said. Dorothea nodded once, settled and certain. "He already told you so," she said. He left her house at 6:30. At 7:45, a black Escalade arranged through the trust's operating account moved quietly through the uptown streets and stopped in front of the Ivies. Harlan stepped out in a dark navy suit, no tie, one button open at the collar. He was unhurried. At his side was Cassandra Blythe in her standard dark blazer, carrying a leather briefcase that was, at this point, approximately 3 inches thick with tabbed, cross-reference documentation. He moved through the lobby the way he moved through job sites, steady pace, observant, nothing performed. He was aware of the room registering his arrival before he reached the event space. Several people in the corridor recognized him. A few stopped mid-conversation. The older ones, the men and women who had been at Reginald Morrow's kitchen table, who had watched Harlan show up at the Belmont Project in January 3 years ago at 6 in the morning and stay until it was right. Those people watched him cross the room, and their expressions shifted in a way that words would have overstated. Simone saw him from across the room. She kept her smile assembled. She crossed to him with a champagne flute and Preston a half-step behind her, wearing an expression that was working very hard to remain confident. "Harlan," she said, lightly, for the room. "I wasn't sure you'd come. You asked me to," he said. "The papers are at the table." She gestured toward a white-clothed banquet table at the center of the room, where a folder rested between the floral centerpieces. "It should only take a few minutes." Harlan looked at her calmly, not with anger, not unkindly, with the particular quality of attention of a man who has nothing left to prove and is at peace with that. "Before anything else," he said, his voice carrying only as far as their small circle, "I want to ask you one question." She tilted her head. "Go ahead. Do you understand what you actually inherited?" The room, which had been moving politely around them, went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something real breaks through the surface. Simone raised her chin. "My father's estate," she said. 38 million in properties and holdings, yes, I understand it." Harlan held her gaze for one more second. Then he looked at Cassandra. Cassandra Blythe did not hurry. She set her briefcase on the edge of the banquet table and opened it with the efficiency of someone who has spent a lifetime organizing complexity into clarity. She laid 6 tabbed document sets across the white linen in a clean, deliberate row and spoke without preamble. The Morrow estate, totaling approximately $38 million across properties, accounts, and operating holdings, was restructured 14 months ago into a private irrevocable trust. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. That trust was deliberately designed with a matching debt obligation, $38 million, built into its legal foundation. Every asset in the estate is encumbered by that debt. The trust has one creditor. She paused. That creditor is Harlan Covey. He alone holds the legal authority to call the debt. The room did not make noise. It absorbed, which was worse. Someone near the bar set down a glass. A woman in the second row drew a slow breath through her nose. Preston Vale's practiced ease left his face in the time it takes a light to go out, replaced by something rapid and calculating, the expression of a man running numbers that were not working out. Simone looked at the documents, then at Harlan. "That's not," she swallowed. "That can't be right." "Page 3, Cassandra said evenly, "is the trust certification. Filed 14 months ago, notarized by 2 independent attorneys and Archie Folsom, who represented the Morrow family for 29 years. She moved to the second set of documents. "This is a separate matter." She placed a bound forensic audit report on the table. Clean cover, Morrow Development letterhead. Over the past 11 months, $1.9 million was moved from Morrow Development operating accounts into 2 accounts. One registered to Simone Covey, one registered to Preston Vale. She said the name without inflection. "This is documented through bank records, internal accounting logs, and wire transfer confirmations. It constitutes financial fraud." The room broke open. Not loudly. These were not people who expressed themselves loudly. But the simultaneous intake of breath across 200 people, the sudden lowering of voices, the sharp collective adjustment of posture, was its own kind of thunder. The older guests, the ones who had known Reginald Morrow for 40 years, who had seen Harlan Covey show up quietly and reliably to every difficult moment the Morrow name had faced, those guests looked at Preston Vale with a judgment that no words could have improved upon. Simone forced a short sound that was meant to be a laugh. It did not quite make it. "This is fabricated," she said, her voice thinner now, the practiced register gone out of it. "He fabricated all of this." Harlan's voice when he spoke was quiet, almost sorrowful, the genuine kind. "Simone," he said, "your father loved you. He also knew you, and he planned accordingly." Then he reached into the breast pocket of his suit. Not for a document, for a letter. A single sheet of paper, folded twice, the creases soft and warm from having been carried close for 14 months. The outside was addressed in a handwriting that at least 40 people in that room recognized immediately as Reginald Morrow's. The deliberate, upright, unhurried cursive of a man who had written birthday notes and business correspondence in the same hand for 5 decades. On the outside, in that unmistakable script, "For the man who stayed." Harlan heard the room recognize the handwriting before he said a word. He unfolded the letter. His hands were completely steady. He cleared his throat once for the acoustics of the room and began to read. "Harlan, if you are reading this where I believe you will read it, then she made the choice I feared. I am sorry for that. Not for you. You are going to be fine. I am sorry for her, because I know exactly what she is losing, and I know she does not. No one moved. I built Morrow Development from one property and 40 years of decisions I was not always sure were right. I nearly lost it once. You saved it. Not because it was your job. Not because any contract required it. Because you are the kind of man who finishes what he starts and protects what he loves. I watched you. Every year of this marriage. I watched how you showed up. I watched what you were willing to carry without complaint." Harlan's jaw tightened once. His voice held. "I could not leave this company to be consumed. Real love for a child does not mean giving her everything she wants. Sometimes it means protecting her from the full damage of who she has chosen to become. I could not look away from what I saw and call that love." He glanced up briefly. The older men near the back of the room were nodding. One had his hands folded. His eyes were closed. "If my daughter removes you from what we built together, let her know this. The Morrow legacy was never built for appetite. It was built to endure, and I leave it to the person with the character to protect it across time." He folded the letter once. "You are that person. You always were. I am proud to have called you son." He folded it again. "Reginald Morrow." The room held for 5 full seconds. Then Simone moved. She had kept herself upright through the entire reading, chin elevated, champagne flute gripped in both hands, every line of her posture insisting she would not be undone by this. And then the letter was folded, and her father's voice was somehow still in the air of that room. Not as a sound, as a presence, as the particular weight of being known completely by the person whose opinion of you has always mattered most. Something in her collapsed. She lunged forward, both hands outstretched, reaching for the letter, as though physical possession of it could undo what the words had already accomplished in that room. Her heel caught the edge of the carpet runner. She went down hard, one knee, then both, the champagne flute shattering on the marble floor in a bright, cold spray. She caught herself on her palms, and what came out of her was not performance. It was not managed. It was the sound of a woman hitting the floor of a truth she had been building the architecture to avoid for 2 years. And finding that the architecture was gone, she sobbed, palms flat against the cold marble. No audience management left in her. Just grief, uncontained and unglamorous, the kind that only arrives when the last story you have been telling yourself about yourself finally becomes impossible to maintain. Nobody rushed to her immediately. Not because the room was without compassion, but because there are moments of honest reckoning that require witnesses to mean anything, and every person in that space understood, without needing to be told, that they were inside one. Across the room, Preston Vale had been making his way unhurriedly toward the service exit near the south wall. He was approximately 10 feet from it when 2 men, coordinated by Cassandra that afternoon, because Cassandra coordinated everything, stepped out of position and filled the frame. "Mr. Vale," said one of them, without drama, "please stay." Preston looked at the man, then at Cassandra, who was watching him with the composed, unsurprised expression of someone who had built that moment into the plan 3 weeks earlier. He stayed. A hotel staff member helped Simone to her feet. She looked across the room at Harlan. She was searching his face for something. Anger, satisfaction, the particular hardness of a man who has arranged to win and wants to be seen winning. She did not find it. What she found was sorrow, genuine, old, worn-in sorrow. The grief of a man who had loved his wife without condition for 11 years, had watched her choose differently across 14 months, and had not enjoyed a single moment of being right about where it was heading. "You kept all of this from me," she said. It was not an accusation. It was something more stripped than that. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. His voice was gentle and exact. "I prepared for it. Those are two different things." He returned the letter to his breast pocket. "And I didn't do this for punishment, Simone. Your father asked me to protect what he built. That is what I did." He held her gaze for one final moment. The unhurried look of a man saying a goodbye he has already, privately, made his peace with. Then he nodded at Cassandra, who was already on her phone. The people who needed to be removed from that room were removed quietly through the side corridor. The chandeliers of the ivies burned on above it all, indifferent and bright. Harlan stood at the center of what had been accomplished and felt, for the first time in 14 months, the clean and settled quiet of a thing completely finished. The Charlotte courts moved with the precision that only happens when one side has nothing left to argue with. Cassandra filed the civil fraud complaint the Monday morning following the event. The forensic audit had been in final form for 3 weeks, 11 months of careful work organized into 19 exhibit folders, cross-referenced and notarized, bank records and wire transfer confirmations, and internal accounting logs going back 24 months. $1.9 million moved in careful increments, each transaction sized to avoid triggering standard review thresholds. Not careful enough. The judgment came down 7 weeks later. Simone Covey and Preston Vale were ordered jointly to repay the full amount plus penalties, interest, and legal costs. Non-compliance would trigger criminal prosecution. There was no viable appeal. Preston retained a defense attorney the morning after the party. By all accounts, he was not sleeping. Simone hired 2 attorneys in 3 weeks and parted ways with both. By the time the judgment came down, she paid because the alternative was worse. It required selling things. The Range Rover purchased the month after the funeral. The wardrobe assembled over 14 months on the Morrow Development corporate account. A bracelet she had bought herself in February and described to friends as an investment. They went through a consignment firm on the south side of the city, in the same boutiques she had walked into 6 months earlier, as though she had always belonged there. She moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in the Noda neighborhood. It was a fine apartment, a reasonable building with good light and a quiet street. It was the kind of apartment she had described 2 years earlier as not where she saw herself. She was wrong about where she saw herself. She had been wrong about several things. As for Preston Vale, his practice did not survive the proceedings. 2 former clients filed complaints that had been sitting in the queue at the state bar for some time, emboldened by the public nature of the case. He surrendered his license in January. By then, he had lost most of what had sustained him socially, because a great deal of his social position had been borrowed against a confidence that the documents in Cassandra Blythe's briefcase had permanently revoked. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday afternoon in Cassandra's conference room, the same table where they had first laid out the plan 14 months earlier. Harlan signed with a plain black pen, the same kind he used for project contracts. He set it down and looked at Cassandra. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze over her reading glasses. "You did the work," she said. "I filed it." "Still," he said. The faintest shift occurred at the corners of her expression, barely detectable, from a woman whose professional register had always been close to impervious. It was the equivalent, from Cassandra Blythe, of a standing ovation. 3 weeks after the judgment, Simone's attorney passed along a question in a procedural call, framed carefully as informal. Simone had seen a photograph, posted by someone who had attended the party without any particular intention, simply capturing a moment that had seemed worth saving. It was a candid shot taken outside the Ivies, just before Harlan went in that evening. He was standing near the Escalade, looking at his phone, composed, and through the passenger window, visible in the background, was a woman sitting quietly with a book open in her lap. Short natural hair, reading glasses. The unhurried, settled quality of someone who is exactly where she intends to be. Simone asked, "Who is that woman?" Harlan's response came through Cassandra's office in writing 3 days later. It said, "Her name is Naomi Whitfield. She is my fiancée. We plan to marry in the spring." No further context was offered. None was needed. Simone read it in her Noda apartment on a Wednesday morning, sitting at a kitchen table she had bought secondhand from a woman in Plaza Midwood who was moving to Portland. She read it twice, then set it down and stood at the window looking out at the street below for a long time. She thought about something her father had told her once, when she was perhaps 12 years old and had dismissed a quiet boy in her class, with a thoughtlessness that she thought had gone unobserved. Reginald had seen. He always had. He said, "Baby girl, the people who don't need to announce themselves are the ones who end up mattering most. Pay attention to them." She had not paid attention. Not to the right things. Not in time. The morning light in Charlotte in early autumn comes in sideways, copper and measured, touching the rooftops of the Dilworth neighborhood one by one as though checking in on each of them. Harlan Covey was on the back porch of the house he now owned outright, the house Reginald had specifically structured into the trust, at 6 in the morning with a cup of coffee he had made in the French press. Naomi had brought over 2 months ago, and set on the kitchen counter with the settled assurance of someone who has decided where she belongs. In his other hand, turning slowly, was his father's watch. A vintage Omega, well worn, the crystal slightly scratched from decades of use. He wound it the way he always did, checked the face, felt the steady, small tick of a mechanism that kept perfect time regardless of everything happening around it. He had carried this watch for 16 years. He had found it, still running, in his father's things. Some things, built right and maintained with care, simply kept going. He looked out at the garden, the same garden where Reginald Morrow had shaken his hand on a Sunday afternoon and said, with wet eyes, "You didn't have to do that, son," and where Harlan had said what he always said in such situations. "Yes, sir, I did." The back door opened. He heard her before he saw her, the particular unhurried sound of bare feet on the porch boards, the quiet, deliberate presence of a woman who does not feel the need to announce herself to a room. Naomi Whitfield slipped her arms around him from behind, her chin resting on his shoulder, her warmth against his back. She did not speak immediately. She looked out at the garden with him, at the morning light working its way through the oak trees at the property line, at the city beginning its day beyond the rooftops. This was one of the things Harlan had come to recognize as essential about her, that she understood silence between two people can be its own form of closeness. She had spent her career as a child psychologist, learning to hold space for what could not yet be spoken. She brought that skill home with her without effort. "The kitchen faucet," she said finally, her voice warm and carrying just the trace of amusement she deployed precisely. "I know," he said. "It's been 3 weeks. I know that. And your mother has sent me 4 separate texts this week with opinions about the rehearsal dinner menu, all of which I appreciate. But 3 of them featured a very specific position on the crawfish étouffée that I want to make sure we are aligned on before we get any further into this process." Harlan laughed. A full laugh, the kind that had been rationed for 14 months and was now returning with the ease of something that had never been lost, only stored. "Tell her she can have the étouffée," he said. "All of it." Naomi reached past him and handed him a second cup of coffee, because she had brought 2, the way she always did because she paid attention. "Are you all right?" she asked. He considered it the way he considered everything, fully and without rush. "Yes," he said. "I genuinely am." And he was. Not the performance of being all right. Not the composed exterior of a man managing something difficult. Actual peace. The particular stillness of a person who has carried a heavy thing for a long time, set it down at exactly the right moment, and walked away without looking back. Dorothea arrived at 11 the way she always did, with a covered dish and her good church dress, and the expression of a woman who had been right about everything and was too gracious to itemize it. She set a sweet potato pie on the kitchen counter. She looked around the house. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone allowing themselves to feel something fully before they move on from it. Then she walked to where her son was standing and put both hands on his face and held it there, the same gesture she had made on 100 mornings when he was young and navigating something difficult. "I am proud of you," she said. "You told me that already," he said. "I am going to keep telling you," she said, "until it's in the bones." She released him and looked past him at Naomi. "Now, that guest bedroom still has no curtains, and this family does not leave things unfinished. We are going to the store this afternoon." Naomi laughed from across the kitchen, the warm, unguarded laugh of a woman who had already decided she was home, and Dorothea winked at her, and the negotiation about the rehearsal dinner began within minutes. Later that evening, after the curtain situation had been resolved, and the pie had been reduced to a pleasantly empty dish, and Dorothea had driven home to Huntersville, with the satisfied air of a woman who had accomplished several things, Harlan stood once more at the back porch railing, with his father's watch in his hand, and the city quiet around him. He let himself think about Simone. Not with bitterness, not with any satisfaction at the dimensions of her loss. With the honest, quiet grief of a man who loved someone faithfully for 11 years and watched her choose poorly, over and over, until there was nothing left to choose. He did not wish her harm. He did not wish her anything except the clarity she had always been capable of and had steadily refused. She had been given something rare. A man who showed up without being asked, who fixed what was broken before it became a problem, who carried what needed carrying without recording the weight. She had looked at all of that and seen only stillness. She had mistaken the depth of still water for the absence of current. He wound the watch one final time, set it against his palm, felt the steady, small, precise tick of a thing built to keep perfect time no matter what was happening in the world outside it. He tucked it into his pocket and went inside to where the lights were warm, and the étouffée negotiation had somehow resumed, and Naomi was laughing at something his mother had said, and the guest bedroom finally had curtains. He was, in every sense that mattered, exactly where he was supposed to be.